The morning air was cool, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves, the earthy smell of autumn settling over the cemetery. Richard stood at the wrought iron gate, his eyes scanning the path ahead, as he took slow, deliberate steps towards the far corner where his son, Lucas, had been laid to rest 2 years ago. The cemetery was quiet, save for the soft rustling of trees in the breeze. This was the time Richard preferred, when the world seemed to pause and he could have a moment to himself. Early mornings, before the hustle and bustle of life invaded, when the sun's first rays barely lit the horizon, casting long shadows across the grounds. A time for quiet reflection, for solitude. Each visit to Lucas's grave felt like an unspoken ritual, an act of mourning that had somehow become routine. Richard's mind wandered as he walked, the memory of his son still sharp, even though the days had blurred into weeks and then months. Lucas, his only child, had been a source of both immense pride and deep disappointment for Richard. He had poured all his expectations into the boy, driven him to achieve more, to be more, always pushing him, never letting up. He had believed that his wealth and influence would give Lucas the strength to rise above any obstacle, but instead, it had created a chasm between them, one that had only grown wider with time. And now, in the quiet of the cemetery, Richard was left alone with his regrets, with the ghost of the son he had never truly understood. He paused before the gravestone, his eyes drawn to the familiar inscription. Lucas R. Harris, beloved son, lost too soon. The words seemed to echo in his mind, each letter etched into his soul. Richard's chest tightened, and he fought the familiar sting of grief that threatened to overtake him. His son was gone, and no amount of wealth or power could change that. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, allowing himself this moment of solitude. But as he stood there, hands clenched at his sides, something felt different today. There was an unease in the air, a strange shift in the atmosphere. Richard furrowed his brow and turned his head slightly, sensing that he was no longer alone. His eyes narrowed, scanning the cemetery grounds. In the distance, a figure stood out against the backdrop of gravestones. A young man, kneeling before Lucas's grave, his head bowed in silent reverence. Richard froze, his gaze locked onto the stranger, confusion washing over him. Who was this? Why was he here? His heart quickened, a ripple of irritation growing within him. This was his time, his space. He had always come here alone, a place where he could grieve in peace, without the watchful eyes of the world or the intrusion of others. And now this boy, this intruder, was violating that sacred solitude. The young man didn't seem to notice Richard approaching, lost in his own world, kneeling with a quiet intensity that was almost reverent. Richard's irritation deepened. His footsteps grew louder, breaking the silence of the morning, and the young man looked up, startled, his eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, they locked eyes, Richard's cold and filled with frustration, the boy's filled with something more, an emotion Richard couldn't place, but it seemed too heavy for someone so young. He wore a dark, worn-out jacket, his hair unkempt, and his face, though youthful, had an air of seriousness to it, as though he carried burdens well beyond his years. The boy quickly rose to his feet, his movements awkward, almost guilty, as if he had been caught in the act of something forbidden. Richard felt a flicker of anger surge through him, and he opened his mouth, ready to demand answers. But before he could speak, the young man hesitated, his lips trembling as if unsure whether he should say anything at all. The silence between them was thick, charged with tension. "Who are you?" Richard asked, his voice sharp, his gaze never leaving the boy. His chest tightened with a sense of violation. This stranger had dared to approach his son's grave, to share this space with him, as if it were his right. The boy stammered for a moment, his eyes darting nervously before speaking in a soft voice. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to intrude." There was a hesitation in his tone, as if he were struggling to explain himself, to make sense of the situation. I knew Lucas. He was a friend of mine." Richard's mind raced. A friend of Lucas? His son had kept to himself in his final years, and Richard had never heard of this boy, this stranger. His brow furrowed deeper. "A friend?" Richard repeated, his disbelief evident. The idea seemed impossible. Who was this boy? And how could he have known Lucas when Richard had always kept a tight hold on his son's life, always overseeing his every move? The young man took a step back, eyes downcast, as if he wanted to avoid any confrontation. Didn't want to cause any trouble. I just wanted to pay my respects." Richard's mind whirled. His grip tightened around the handle of his walking cane, frustration clouding his thoughts. He was angry, not just at the boy, but at the situation itself, the sudden intrusion into his grief. He had never shared Lucas with anyone, certainly not with a stranger like this. The last thing he wanted was to stand here, exchanging pleasantries with someone who clearly didn't belong. "Who are you really?" Richard demanded, his voice now rising with the edge of authority he had used so often in his life. "And how do you know my son?" The boy's eyes flickered nervously. He seemed caught between wanting to explain himself and not knowing how to reveal the truth. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Lucas, he was my father." Richard's entire body went rigid at the words, as though the ground beneath him had shifted. His mind refused to process what the boy had just said. Father? Lucas had been dead for 2 years, and now this young man was telling him that Lucas had a child? Richard's thoughts tangled in disbelief, and for a long moment, he couldn't respond. His heart thudded loudly in his chest, a mix of shock, confusion, and something darker, something that felt like betrayal. The boy took a step back, eyes downcast. "I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't think you'd want to know." Richard stood frozen, staring at the young man before him, his mind reeling from the revelation. His son had a child, a secret family, a life Richard had never known about. The anger and confusion surged inside him, but more than that, something else stirred. A pang of guilt, something deeper than anything he had ever felt before. How had he missed this? How had Lucas hidden something so important from him? Before Richard could speak, the boy turned and hurriedly walked away, leaving Richard standing alone at the grave of his son. His heart raced, his thoughts spinning in a whirlwind of confusion. He had come to the cemetery to mourn, to visit his son. But now the landscape of his life had been irrevocably altered. His son had kept secrets from him, and now Richard had a grandson, one he hadn't known existed. Richard stood frozen for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the retreating figure of the young man, his heart still pounding in his chest. The boy had turned and walked away quickly, leaving Richard standing at his son's grave, his thoughts a jumbled mess of confusion and disbelief. The quiet of the cemetery seemed almost oppressive now, suffocating, as if the ground itself was holding its breath, waiting for Richard to make sense of what had just happened. The air, once crisp and refreshing, now felt cold, biting against his skin. Richard glanced down at the dirt beneath his feet, the earth that had swallowed his son 2 years ago. But now it felt different, tainted by the stranger's presence, a presence that had no place here. Who was he? How could he be connected to Lucas, the son Richard had always believed he knew so well? Richard's mind churned as he walked slowly back toward the grave, his cane tapping against the ground with each step. The boy had said Lucas was his father, a statement that had struck Richard like a blow. But how could that be? Lucas, his only child, had never mentioned anything about a child of his own. Richard had prided himself on knowing everything about his son, his likes, his dislikes, his ambitions, even the people he associated with. And yet, here was this boy, standing in front of him, claiming a connection to Lucas that Richard had never even suspected. The silence of the cemetery pressed in on him, and Richard couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He had come here, as he always did, to mourn Lucas, to grieve the loss of the son he had lost in that tragic accident 2 years ago. But now, instead of peace, there was only chaos. The calm certainty of his grief had been shattered, and in its place was an unsettling sense of betrayal. The boy's pale blue eyes haunted Richard's thoughts. There had been something about him, something fragile and yet determined in his gaze. He didn't look like a typical rebellious teenager, nor did he seem like someone trying to cause trouble. There was a quiet sorrow in his expression, a weight of pain that Richard couldn't quite place. And yet, the boy had fled before Richard could ask more questions, disappearing into the cemetery as though the encounter had been nothing more than an accident. Richard's frustration flared up once more. Why had the boy come? What had prompted him to visit Lucas's grave in the first place? There was no logical explanation. Lucas had been such a private person in the final years of his life, and Richard had never heard mention of a child. But even as the anger surged within him, Richard couldn't help but feel a growing curiosity, a need to uncover the truth, to understand this mystery that had suddenly invaded his carefully controlled world. He was about to leave, to turn away and forget the encounter ever happened, when a voice from behind startled him. "Are you all right, sir?" It was the voice of the cemetery caretaker, an elderly man who had worked there for years. His voice was soft, almost apologetic, as though he was intruding on something private. "I saw that boy earlier. He's been coming around a lot lately." Richard turned to face the caretaker, his irritation barely under control. "What do you mean, coming around? Who is he?" The caretaker scratched his thinning white hair and sighed. "Don't rightly know his name, but he's been here more than once. Always the same, kneeling at that grave. I tried to ask him once, but he got real quiet and just walked off." The old man paused, as if considering whether to say more. "He seems troubled, like he's got something weighing heavy on him." Richard's eyes narrowed, his frustration now mingling with suspicion. "And you didn't think to tell me? You didn't think to warn me that some stranger was visiting my son's grave?" The caretaker took a step back, clearly startled by the harshness in Richard's tone. "I didn't mean any harm, sir. I thought maybe the boy had a connection to the place. Maybe he knew Lucas in a way none of us did." He paused, then added with a softer tone, "I'm sorry. I didn't realize it was such a big deal." Richard stared at him for a long moment, a mixture of anger and confusion bubbling within him. A connection to Lucas in a way none of us did? What did that mean? How could anyone, have known his son better than he had? The more Richard thought about it, the more the weight of the mystery pressed down on him. He had to know more. "Where can I find this boy?" Richard demanded, his voice low and intense. "I need to speak with him." The caretaker hesitated, glancing at the ground as if considering how best to answer. Finally, he spoke. "I don't know where he lives. He comes and goes, always at odd hours. Sometimes he just appears. But I think he works over at the local diner. You might catch him there." Richard nodded sharply, turning on his heel. "Thank you," he muttered, already plotting his next move. He would find this boy, this stranger who claimed to be Lucas's son, and he would get answers. The caretaker watched him go, his face clouded with concern. Richard could feel the old man's eyes on his back, but he didn't care. Nothing else mattered right now, except uncovering the truth. The questions swirling in his mind were too overwhelming, too consuming to ignore. Who was this boy? What connection did he have to Lucas? And, perhaps most importantly, why had Lucas kept him a secret? As Richard stepped out of the cemetery, the cool autumn wind biting at his skin, he realized that his world had just shifted in a way he couldn't yet understand. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to rest until he had answers. Until he knew the truth about this unfamiliar stranger and the secret life his son had left behind. The days that followed the strange encounter at Lucas's grave were filled with an unshakable restlessness. Richard could not escape the image of the young man kneeling at his son's headstone, nor the haunting question that had burned into his mind. Who was he? It gnawed at him day and night, the mystery growing more insistent with each passing hour. At first, Richard tried to reason with himself. He told himself it was just a coincidence, that the boy had perhaps mistaken the grave for someone else's, or that he had a random, inexplicable connection to Lucas. But the more he thought about it, the more unlikely those explanations seemed. There was something in the boy's eyes, something too personal, too familiar, that made Richard believe the truth was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. He spent sleepless nights replaying their brief interaction in his mind, obsessing over every detail. The way the boy had looked at him, almost pleadingly, as if waiting for something, waiting for Richard to recognize him. Richard's frustration mounted, and with it, the nagging sense that there were answers hidden just out of reach, waiting to be uncovered. He couldn't rest. He couldn't move on until he knew the truth. So, Richard did what he did best when faced with an insurmountable problem. He threw money at it. He hired a private investigator, someone known for getting to the bottom of the most complex and sensitive matters. Richard gave the investigator the little information he had. The boy's name? Eli, and the fact that he had been seen at the cemetery. The next few days felt like an eternity. Richard's anxiety grew with each passing hour, but he refused to let it show. He continued with his daily routines, managing his business affairs with the same precision and control he had always maintained. But his mind was never fully present. It was always on the boy, always on the need to find out who Eli really was and what he had to do with Lucas. Finally, after what felt like an agonizing week, the investigator contacted him. Richard sat up straight in his office chair, the phone pressed to his ear as the investigator's voice crackled through. "I've got the results, Mr. Renard," the investigator said, his tone professional but guarded. It's not what you were expecting." Richard's heart pounded in his chest. "What do you mean?" The investigator hesitated before continuing. "The young man, Eli, he is Lucas's son. Your grandson, Mr. Renard." Richard's breath caught in his throat. His hands, previously steady, gripped the edge of his desk as he struggled to process the words. Lucas's son? He had never heard anything about a son. No one had ever mentioned a child. Lucas had always been private, but this was something beyond privacy. This was a secret so deeply buried that even Richard, a man who prided himself on knowing everything about his son, had never uncovered it. "Are you sure?" Richard's voice was thick, as if the weight of the revelation had physically pressed down on him. The investigator took a deep breath. "I've confirmed it through various sources. Eli was born a few years before Lucas's accident. His mother, a woman named Sophie Turner, was someone Lucas briefly dated in college. After the breakup, she raised Eli on her own, keeping him out of the public eye. She never made any attempt to contact Lucas. And from what I've gathered, Lucas never knew about his son until shortly before his death." Richard's mind raced, trying to fit together the pieces of this puzzle. Sophie Turner? He had never heard the name before. How could this have happened without him ever knowing? How could Lucas, his son, his only child, have kept something like this a secret for so long? The investigator's voice interrupted his thoughts. "I also found out that Eli has been coming to the cemetery because he learned about Lucas's grave from a mutual acquaintance. He wanted to pay his respects, but he also seemed to be looking for answers, much like you." Richard swallowed hard, his mind reeling. Eli, his grandson. A young man who had grown up without his father, never knowing his true identity. Lucas had a son, and I didn't even know about him. Richard felt a strange mix of emotions: betrayal, shock, confusion, and a deep, aching sorrow. "Where is he now?" Richard asked, his voice barely a whisper. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. "According to my sources, Eli is working at a diner on the outskirts of town. I've got the address if you want to go see him." Richard's hand trembled as he reached for a pen. "Yes, send me the information. I'll go there myself." The investigator gave him the details and ended the call. Richard sat still for a moment, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him like a heavy, unmovable force. He had spent so much time focusing on the grief of losing Lucas, on the pain of never being able to reconcile their differences before his death. But now, a new truth had emerged, one that Richard couldn't ignore, no matter how hard he tried. Lucas had a son Richard had never known about, a son who was now living in the shadows of the life Lucas had left behind. Richard felt a strange pang of responsibility. His son's secret had become his burden, and it was one that he couldn't simply brush away. No matter the reasons behind Lucas's silence, the truth was clear now. Eli needed answers, and Richard, whether he liked it or not, was the one who had to provide them. With a heavy heart, Richard rose from his desk, his mind filled with a new mission. He would find Eli. He would meet this young man, this grandson he never knew existed, and together they would piece together the fragments of a family's lost history. The past had been shattered, but Richard knew that if he could uncover the full truth, there might still be a way to heal the wounds that had been left behind. But as he prepared to leave his office, one thought haunted him. Why had Lucas kept this secret? And what did it mean for the future of their fractured family? Richard's heart thundered in his chest as he sat in his luxurious car, the weight of the private investigator's revelations crashing over him. He had spent years controlling every aspect of his life, building his empire from the ground up. Convinced that success was a matter of sheer willpower, he had shaped Lucas's future, pushed him toward greatness, even though their relationship had been strained. He had never imagined there was something hidden beneath the surface, something so fundamental that it could shatter the foundation of everything he thought he knew. Lucas had been involved with a woman named Clara, a name Richard had never heard before. She had been a part of his son's life, even if Richard hadn't known about her. From that relationship, Eli had been born, a child that Richard had no knowledge of, a grandson, his grandson. The thought hit him like a tidal wave, overwhelming him with a dizzying mix of emotions. There was anger, yes, and betrayal. But there was also a deep, suffocating sadness, as if the discovery had opened up an old wound that he had long ago buried deep within himself. How had Lucas kept this from him? How had his own son, whom Richard had watched grow from a boy into a man, been involved in something so significant, yet kept it hidden? Richard had always thought he was a father who understood his son's every move, every ambition. But this was a secret that had completely eluded him, a secret that seemed to tear at the very fabric of their relationship. The more Richard thought about it, the more he realized how little he had truly known about Lucas. Despite all his wealth and power, Richard had never been able to truly connect with his son on an emotional level. They had always been distant, their relationship marked by Richard's relentless pressure for Lucas to succeed, to live up to expectations. He had pushed Lucas to be a reflection of his own success, to carry on the family name and legacy. In doing so, he had overlooked the personal side of his son's life, the emotional struggles, the secrets, the relationships Lucas had tried to keep private. And now, Richard had a grandson, a young man named Eli, raised in the shadows of the family empire, never a part of the wealth, the power, or the prestige Richard had fought so hard to build. Richard had been too focused on his own vision, too consumed with the idea of creating a dynasty, that he had missed the quiet existence of a family member who had lived entirely outside of it. Eli had grown up in poverty, far from the riches Richard had accumulated. And yet, despite his circumstances, there was a part of Richard that couldn't help but feel a deep connection to the boy, to the blood that ran through his veins. As Richard sat in his car, staring out the window, the weight of the revelation began to sink in. He was angry, of course. Angry at Lucas for keeping such a vital part of his life a secret. Angry at himself for not noticing the cracks in their relationship. But beneath that anger was a sense of regret, a regret that stretched back through the years. How many times had he missed an opportunity to truly connect with Lucas, to offer him understanding and compassion instead of expectations? How many times had he failed to see the depth of his son's struggles, his quiet pain? But there was something else, something even more pressing. Eli, his grandson. Richard didn't know him, didn't know anything about him, except that he had been abandoned by his father and raised without the support of the family he should have had. That thought cut deep. How could Richard have allowed that to happen? How could he have allowed his own flesh and blood to live in the shadows, forgotten and unseen? He couldn't undo the past, couldn't change the way things had unfolded. But he could make things right, at least in some way. He could reach out to Eli. He could offer him the truth, offer him a connection to a family that had failed him. But how? What did he say to a young man who had spent his whole life without him, without the knowledge of the family empire, without a connection to the legacy Richard had spent his entire life building? The car pulled up in front of the diner, and Richard's thoughts came to an abrupt halt. He stepped out, his mind still whirling with 1,000 questions, 1,000 emotions. The diner was small, a humble establishment with flickering neon lights and a worn sign hanging above the door. Richard looked up at the place, his eyes narrowing. This was where his grandson had spent his life? In a place like this, far from the luxury and comfort Richard had always known? Richard's steps were deliberate as he made his way through the door. The bell above the entrance chimed as he entered, the warm smell of coffee and grilled food filling the air. It wasn't much, but Richard could tell it had a certain charm. The few patrons in the diner barely looked up as he entered, absorbed in their own conversations. And then, behind the counter, he saw him. Eli. The young man was wiping down the counter, his back to Richard. He was wearing a faded apron, his hands moving with the fluid motions of someone who had worked here for years. Richard stood still for a moment, taking in the sight of him. The resemblance to Lucas was unmistakable. The same sharp jawline, the same blue eyes that seemed to carry a weight far beyond his years. And yet there was something more. something more than just a physical resemblance. There was a quiet strength in the way Eli moved, a subtle confidence in the way he held himself, as if he had been forced to grow up too quickly, to survive in a world that had never given him a chance. Richard felt a pang of guilt as he approached the counter, the weight of everything he had just learned pressing down on him. He cleared his throat, and Eli turned, his eyes locking with Richard's. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. Richard searched Eli's face, trying to read the young man, trying to understand what this moment meant for both of them. Finally, Eli spoke, his voice low but steady. "You're Richard Rennard, aren't you?" Richard nodded, his throat tightening. "Yes, I am." Eli's gaze didn't falter, but there was a flicker of something like recognition or perhaps suspicion in his eyes. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone guarded. Richard swallowed hard. He had no answers, no explanations for what had happened. All he could do was offer the truth about who they were, about the family they had both lost. "I want to talk to you," he said quietly. "I want to explain." Eli's expression didn't change, but Richard could see the tension in his posture, the wariness that remained. Richard didn't know what the future would hold, didn't know if Eli would ever accept him or forgive him for his past failures. But he knew one thing for sure. This was a moment of reckoning. A chance to bridge the gap between the past and the future, to make amends for the mistakes that had haunted him for so long. Richard couldn't shake the weight of the past few days. Every conversation, every moment of silence had only deepened the turmoil that churned inside him. The truth about Eli had been a blow, but it was also a revelation, a chance to change the course of his future, even if that future was uncertain and fraught with regret. His mind was made up. He would meet Eli face to face, explain everything, and find a way to connect with the grandson he had never known. It wasn't just a matter of clearing his conscience. It was a matter of making up for lost time, of doing something good with the years that had slipped by in pursuit of success and power. The private investigator had done his work efficiently, tracking Eli to a modest, working-class neighborhood on the edge of the city. Richard was used to the clean streets, the grand mansions, the gleaming facades of the world he inhabited. This place, however, was a far cry from that. The homes were small and weathered, their paint peeling, lawns unkempt. It was a stark contrast to the life Richard had spent his entire existence building, a life of excess, of carefully manicured appearances, of wealth that stretched as far as the eye could see. Yet here, in this humble neighborhood, was the reality of the man he had left behind, the grandson who had lived a life of struggle, of hardship, far removed from the privileges Richard had always taken for granted. Despite the dissonance, Richard found himself drawn to this neighborhood, his heart heavy with a sense of guilt and responsibility. He had never considered what life was like outside of his bubble, how others lived, what they went through, how people like Eli were forced to grow up. It wasn't just about money. It was about the experiences that shaped a person, the pain, the resilience, and the quiet fortitude it took to survive when the world didn't offer you anything. He parked his car a few blocks away from the address the investigator had provided. It was a late afternoon, the sun sinking lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the street. As Richard stepped out of the vehicle, the chill of the autumn air brushed against his skin, and he wrapped his coat tighter around himself. The neighborhood was peaceful, almost eerily so. The sounds of children playing in the distance, the occasional hum of a car passing by, and the distant rattle of a garbage can in the wind were the only noises that filled the air. No mansions here. No sprawling estates, just the quiet hum of ordinary life. Richard walked slowly down the sidewalk, trying to steady the racing thoughts in his head. He was unsure of what he would say to Eli, unsure of how the young man would react. How do you approach someone you've wronged, someone you've never even known, and explain the unexplainable? Richard's entire life had been about control, about never showing weakness, about never letting others see the cracks in his carefully constructed armor. But now, standing in this modest neighborhood, he felt vulnerable. He was no longer the man who controlled everything around him. He was just a father and a grandfather, searching for a connection that had been lost in the shuffle of time. When he finally reached the address, Richard hesitated for a moment. The house was small but well kept, a far cry from the dilapidated structures around it. It stood out, though not in a flashy way, more like a quiet testament to the care and effort Eli had put into making this place his own. There was no grandeur here, no opulence, but there was something else. Something that made Richard pause. It was the kind of place that spoke of modest dreams, of resilience, and perhaps of a life that had been built with nothing but hard work. He knocked on the door, his knuckles rapping sharply against the wood. His heart raced in his chest, but he steadied himself. A few seconds later, the door opened. Eli stood there, a surprised but guarded look on his face. Richard noticed the way Eli's eyes flicked over him, curious but cautious, as if unsure whether he should welcome the visitor or slam the door shut. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Eli's expression softened slightly, though the wariness remained. "Mr. Renard," he said, his voice steady, but with a note of skepticism. "Eli," Richard replied, his throat tight. He paused for a moment before speaking again, trying to find the right words, trying to convey everything he had been feeling since the moment he first learned of the young man's existence. I know this must be a lot to take in." Eli crossed his arms, leaning slightly against the doorframe. "A lot? You could say that, but I'm not sure what there is to talk about." Richard's heart sank at the coldness in Eli's tone. He had expected hesitation, but not this level of distance, this almost palpable sense of distrust. It was understandable, of course. Richard had been absent for Eli's entire life, a ghost in the background. And now he was here, standing on Eli's doorstep, a stranger trying to make amends for a lifetime of neglect. But Richard couldn't back down. This was his grandson, the one link to his son that he had never even known existed. He had to try. "I know I'm the last person you'd want to talk to," Richard said, his voice softer now. "I'm not here to make excuses or ask for your forgiveness, but I want to be clear about one thing. I'm not here to just forget you. You're my family, Eli, and I failed you." Eli's eyes narrowed slightly, but his posture remained defensive. "Failed me?" he asked, his voice a little sharper now. "You didn't even know I existed. How could you have failed me?" Richard swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words. "I failed you by not being there, by not knowing about you. My son, your father, he kept this from me. But that doesn't excuse the fact that I should have done more. I should have been there for you." Eli studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Richard couldn't tell what the young man was thinking, but the silence between them was heavy, thick with the unspoken history that hung in the air. Finally, Eli spoke again, his voice more subdued now, though still wary. "I don't know what to make of all this," he said. "I've spent my whole life without a family. I've made my peace with that. I don't know what you want from me now." Richard felt a pang of guilt at the words. Eli had lived without the security, without the support that Richard had always taken for granted. He had grown up with nothing, with no father to guide him, no family to offer him comfort. Richard had failed him, not just as a grandfather, but as a man who should have understood what truly mattered. "I don't want anything from you," Richard said, his voice firm but tinged with sincerity. "I don't want to force anything on you. I want to make things right as much as I can. I can't change the past, Eli, but I want to be here now. I want to be a part of your life, if you'll let me." Eli's gaze softened just slightly, but the skepticism in his eyes remained. "I don't know if I'm ready for that." Richard nodded, feeling the weight of Eli's words settle in his chest. "I understand," he said quietly. "I'm not going anywhere. But if you ever want to talk, or if you ever want to know more, I'm here." With that, Richard turned and walked away, his heart heavy, but his resolve stronger than ever. He didn't know what the future held, or if Eli would ever accept him into his life. But Richard knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. He had a new mission now to prove to Eli and to himself that it was never too late to make things right. Richard's steps grew heavier as he approached the door of the modest house. The neighborhood, once so foreign to him, now felt almost suffocating in its simplicity. It wasn't just the houses or the uneven pavement. It was the weight of the unknown, the fear of rejection that pressed down on him. He had found Eli, but there was still so much more to face, so much more he had to learn about the life his grandson had lived, the life that had been shaped in part by his own failures. When he reached the front door and rang the bell, Richard felt his heart race. He had already met Eli, but this was different. Clara, Eli's mother, was another matter entirely. She was a stranger to him, but she was not simply a peripheral figure in this story. She was a key to understanding Eli's world, a link to a past that Richard had never been a part of. He had to meet her, had to find out how they had lived without him, and why she had never reached out to him about Eli. The door creaked open, and there stood Clara. Her dark hair, once perhaps vibrant, now appeared a bit weary, as though the years had taken their toll. Her eyes were sharp, and the suspicion in her gaze was immediate. Richard didn't flinch, but he could feel the coldness radiating from her. It was clear she knew exactly who he was, and it was equally clear that she had no love for him. Yes? Her voice was steady but guarded, as if she were prepared for whatever confrontation might come. "I'm Richard Renard," Richard began, trying to keep his voice steady, though his nerves were threatening to break through. "I've come to talk about Eli." Clara's face tightened at the mention of her son's name, and she didn't hide her wariness. "What about him?" she asked sharply. "We've lived just fine without you, Mr. Renard. Eli doesn't need you now. He's grown up without your interference, and that's been for the best." The words hit Richard harder than he expected. They were true, in a way. Eli had indeed lived without him, without any family support, without the wealth and connections Richard had spent his life cultivating. It was a stark reminder of the many years that had passed without him even knowing his grandson existed, and it stung. But Richard wasn't there to argue. He wasn't there to make excuses. He had come with one purpose: to bridge the gap between himself and Eli. "I know I'm not what you expected," Richard said quietly, taking a step forward, though Clara didn't step back. "I know I'm the last person you wanted in Eli's life. I made mistakes, Clara, big ones, and I know I can't change the past, but I want to change the future. I want to be a part of Eli's life, if he'll have me. I won't push him. I just want him to know that I'm here and I care." Clara's lips tightened, but she didn't speak immediately. Instead, she studied Richard, her gaze unwavering, as if she were trying to see past his wealth and his status, to understand what lay beneath the surface of his carefully constructed persona. Richard had never been good at showing vulnerability, at admitting when he had been wrong. But now, standing in front of this woman who had raised his grandson alone, he felt a deep need to be honest. "I failed as a father," Richard continued, his voice softer now, the edge of pride gone. "I pushed Lucas too hard. I made him into something he wasn't, and in doing so, I lost sight of what really mattered. I failed him, and now I'm failing Eli by not being there sooner." Clara's eyes flickered, and for a moment, Richard thought he saw something like sorrow in them. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced once more by that impenetrable wall of coldness. She crossed her arms, still standing firm in the doorway. "That's a lot of words, Mr. Renard. But words don't change anything. You're right about one thing. You can't change the past. But Eli's past isn't something I'll just let you walk into, just because you decide you want to be a grandfather now." Richard took a deep breath, understanding the weight of her words. "I'm not here to make things easy. I'm here to make them right. If Eli wants nothing to do with me, I will accept that, but I will not walk away without trying." There was a long silence, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant hum of traffic. Richard stood there, feeling the sting of Clara's rejection, but also a new sense of resolve. He had nothing to offer but his honesty and his willingness to try. He couldn't change the mistakes of the past, but he could be there for Eli now. And that had to count for something. Clara finally sighed, uncrossing her arms. "You really think you can just walk in and make things better?" she asked, her voice softening slightly, though the hardness in her eyes remained. "You've got a lot of making up to do, Richard. A lot." Richard nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "I know," he said quietly, "but I'll start with whatever Eli is willing to give me. If I can be part of his life, even in some small way, that's all I ask for." Clara studied him for another long moment. Richard could almost see the wheels turning in her mind. She wasn't ready to forgive him, wasn't ready to accept him into their lives, but there was something there, something that told Richard she wasn't entirely dismissing him. She wasn't closing the door completely. After what felt like an eternity, Clara nodded slowly. "I'll talk to Eli," she said, But I can't promise you anything. He's been through a lot, and I won't let you hurt him again. Richard felt a spark of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. He could work with that. Thank you, he said, his voice earnest. I'll wait for your call. Clara didn't respond. She simply closed the door, leaving Richard standing on the stoop, his thoughts swirling. He had taken a step forward, but the road ahead was still long and uncertain. He had no guarantees, no promises of success. But for the first time in years, Richard felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, the possibility of redemption. As he walked back down the porch steps and into the street, he made a vow to himself. He would be patient. He would give Eli the space he needed, but he would never give up on trying. He owed it to his son, to his grandson, and most of all, to himself. The phone call came the following morning, and Richard's heart skipped a beat when he saw Clara's name appear on the screen. He had spent the night replaying their conversation in his mind, unsure of whether his words had made any difference. He had spoken from the heart, but in the silence that followed, there had been no indication of how Clara felt about his offer. Now, as he answered the call, he steeled himself for whatever news came next. Mr. Renard? Clara's voice was as guarded as ever, but there was a note of something else, perhaps resignation, perhaps relief. Eli has agreed to meet with you, but not here. He wants to meet on his terms. Richard's breath caught in his throat. Of course, I'll meet him wherever he feels comfortable. Clara paused before continuing. He's been through a lot, Mr. Renard. He doesn't trust easily, and he doesn't forgive easily either. So you need to be prepared. This isn't going to be easy for either of you. I understand, Richard replied, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. He had expected resistance. He had earned it. But hearing Clara's words only deepened his sense of urgency. He had to make this right, no matter how difficult it would be. They arranged a time for Eli to meet him at Richard's office. It wasn't the most personal setting, but it was neutral ground, a place where Richard hoped they could have an honest conversation without the weight of family history looming over them. He spent the rest of the day preparing, mentally rehearsing everything he planned to say. But as the time drew closer, the knot in his stomach tightened. What if Eli rejected him outright? What if his past sins were too great to overcome? The moment Eli walked into the office, Richard knew that this wouldn't be an easy conversation. Eli was tall, with a quiet intensity about him that reminded Richard of Lucas, though far less polished, more raw. His hair was a little disheveled, his clothes simple but well-worn. There was no trace of the privileged life Richard had once expected to give his son. In that instant, Richard understood just how different Eli's life had been from his own, and how much he had missed out on by failing to be there. Eli's eyes locked with Richard's, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The silence hung heavy between them, filled with so many unspoken thoughts. Then Eli crossed his arms, his posture defensive, and finally broke the stillness. So, what's this all about? His voice was wary, tinged with suspicion. You've been living your life, building your empire, and now you suddenly want to be a part of mine? Why? Why now, after all these years? Richard felt the weight of Eli's words press down on him, but he wasn't about to retreat. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the chance to make things right, no matter how difficult the conversation might be. I know I don't have the right to ask for anything from you, Richard said, his voice quiet but firm. I've failed you, Eli, and I've failed your mother. I've spent my life chasing power and success, thinking that if I could just achieve more, everything would fall into place. But I was wrong. I was wrong about Lucas, and I was wrong about you. I never knew about you until recently, and I know it doesn't make sense, but I want you to know that I'm here now, and I want to be a part of your life, if you'll let me. Eli's expression didn't soften. If anything, it became harder. His gaze narrowed, and his voice grew colder as he stepped forward, his words sharp as daggers. You didn't know about me? Really? How's that possible, huh? He scoffed, disbelief etched in every line of his face. How do you not know you have a grandson? Your son's dead, and you didn't even care enough to find out? You didn't care enough to look for me, to ask about me, to... His voice cracked, and for the first time, Richard saw the raw pain that lay beneath Eli's anger. The boy was hurting, and that hurt was all directed at Richard. Richard didn't flinch. Instead, he took a step closer, his hands held loosely by his sides, trying to communicate sincerity with every gesture. I didn't know, Eli. I swear I didn't, and I wish to God I had. I've made so many mistakes, but not knowing you, not being there for you, that's the one I regret most of all. I don't expect you to forgive me, or even to trust me, but I want to try. I can't undo the past, but I want to be there for you now, if you'll let me. Eli shook his head, turning away for a moment as if to collect himself. His shoulders were tense, his jaw clenched, and Richard could see the internal struggle written across his face. Eli wanted to lash out, to deny Richard the satisfaction of his apology, but he was torn between his anger and something deeper, something that, perhaps, he didn't even understand yet. Finally, Eli spoke again, his voice quieter now, but still edged with bitterness. You're asking for forgiveness, but it doesn't work like that. You don't get to just walk into my life after everything that's happened, after all the years I've lived without you. I don't know what you want from me, but I don't trust you. Richard nodded, accepting the weight of Eli's words. I don't expect you to trust me right away. I wouldn't trust me either. But I'm not going anywhere. I'm not asking for a second chance, Eli. I'm just asking for a chance to be part of your life, to get to know you. No expectations, no strings attached. I won't push you, I promise. Eli was silent for a long time, his gaze flickering between Richard's earnest face and the floor. It seemed as though the decision was not one he could make easily, but after a long pause, he sighed, his voice barely audible. I don't know if I can do this, but I'll give you one shot. One chance. Don't mess it up. Richard's heart lifted, though he knew this was far from a resolution. This was just the beginning of a long road, one that would require patience, understanding, and most of all, a commitment to change. But for the first time in a long time, Richard felt a glimmer of hope. He had a chance to be there for Eli, to make things right, and he would do whatever it took to prove that he was worthy of that chance. Thank you, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. I won't mess it up, I promise. The minutes following Eli's departure felt like hours to Richard. His office, which had once been a place of authority and success, now felt cold and suffocating. The echoes of Eli's words rang in his ears. You don't get to just walk into my life after everything that's happened. Richard could feel the weight of that truth pressing down on him, suffocating the air from his lungs. He knew he had been an absent father, that his relentless drive for power had consumed him. And in doing so, he had lost sight of what truly mattered, his family. He had failed his son Lucas, and now his grandson Eli. As the door closed behind Eli, Richard stood motionless in the center of the room, his mind reeling. The guilt that had long festered inside him had always been buried beneath layers of work and success. He had convinced himself that his achievements justified his absence, that providing for his family meant something. But now, standing in the wake of Eli's anger, Richard understood just how hollow that belief had been. His son was gone, and all the wealth in the world couldn't bring him back. And now, the grandson he never knew existed was filled with resentment that was directed at him, the man who should have been there all along. Richard's mind drifted to Lucas. How many times had he pushed him, demanding more, always expecting perfection? How many birthdays had he missed? How many games, graduations, or quiet moments had he sacrificed on the altar of his career? The thought of all the missed opportunities, his son's laughter, the times they could have spent together, tore at his chest. Lucas had always been a sensitive soul, and Richard had never taken the time to understand him. Lucas had felt the weight of his father's expectations, and in the end, it had been too much. Now, Richard was faced with the consequences of his actions, his son's death, and the deep, growing chasm between him and Eli, a child he had never even known. There was no way to undo the damage, no way to change the past. But Richard was determined to do better, to show Eli that he wasn't just a distant figure, a man with a title and a bank account full of money. He needed to prove that he could be the grandfather Eli deserved, even if it meant starting from nothing. For the next few days, Richard found himself lost in thought, grappling with his guilt. It weighed on him at all hours, eating away at him when he least expected it. He couldn't focus on his work, couldn't throw himself into his meetings or his investments like he had in the past. Every success now felt hollow, each deal more meaningless than the last. His mind would inevitably wander back to Eli, to the disappointment and anger in the young man's eyes. And Richard could not shake the feeling that he had lost something irreplaceable. He spent hours thinking about what he could do to prove his sincerity. Gifts, grand gestures, words, they all seemed shallow, too easy, too meaningless. Eli didn't need his money or his power. What he needed, Richard realized, was something much harder to give: his time, his undivided attention, his genuine effort to be present in Eli's life. That was the only thing that could possibly begin to heal the wounds that had been opened between them. But how could he earn that chance? How could he prove to Eli that he had changed? One morning, as Richard sat at his desk staring out the window, the solution finally came to him. It wasn't about apologizing again or offering to make things right in the grandest sense. It was about showing up. It was about doing the small things that over time would prove his commitment. It would be showing Eli that he could be relied upon, that he could be a constant presence in his life. If Eli would allow him the opportunity, Richard would earn his place by simply being there, by doing whatever was necessary to build a relationship from the ground up. And so, Richard took the first step. He called Clara, asking if Eli was available to meet again, this time outside the confines of his office, in a setting that felt more personal. To his surprise, Clara agreed. She said that Eli had been asking questions about Richard, but he wasn't ready to open up. She warned Richard that it would take time and patience, things that Richard hadn't always been good at, but he was willing to try. He had no other choice. The next day, Richard found himself standing outside a small cafe on the outskirts of town, his heart pounding in his chest. It wasn't the kind of place he was used to. There were no private rooms, no expensive decor, no business suits or power lunches. This was a quiet, simple cafe, far from the world of high-rises and boardrooms that Richard had always inhabited. But in that moment, it was exactly where he needed to be. He had arrived early, sitting alone at a table in the corner, nursing a cup of coffee as he tried to collect his thoughts. He wasn't sure what to expect from this meeting, but he knew it was a chance to begin the process of rebuilding. He would wait for Eli to show up, just as he had promised, without any rush, without any agenda. Eli arrived a few minutes late, his hands shoved in the pockets of his worn jacket. He looked more relaxed than when they had met at the office, but there was still a wariness in his eyes. Richard stood up as Eli approached, offering a tentative smile. "I'm glad you came," Richard said softly, his voice laced with both relief and guilt. Eli didn't respond immediately, but Richard saw the flicker of something in his eyes. Whether it was curiosity or hesitation, Richard didn't know. But it was a start. They sat down together, and for a long while, neither spoke. It wasn't comfortable, but Richard knew this was the beginning of something, a slow, tentative rebuilding of trust. And as they sat in silence, Richard felt the weight of his past failures and his guilt, but he also felt a small spark of hope. Maybe it wouldn't be easy, and maybe it wouldn't happen overnight, but he was willing to keep showing up, again and again, until Eli knew that he was serious. It would be a long road, filled with moments of doubt and frustration. But Richard was determined. This time, he wasn't going to fail. The days turned into weeks, and slowly but surely, Richard began to carve out a place in Eli's life. It wasn't easy, and there were still many silent moments between them, filled with unspoken doubts. But Richard understood that trust wasn't something that could be earned overnight, not after so many years of absence, and certainly not after the harsh words Eli had spoken to him. If there was one thing Richard had learned from all of this, it was patience. The first step was simple. Richard didn't try to overwhelm Eli with promises or apologies. Instead, he showed up, quietly, without fanfare. He began offering help with small tasks around Eli's modest home. Nothing extravagant, nothing that screamed, "I'm trying to buy your affection." It was just the basics, fixing a broken fence, repairing a leaky faucet, making sure the lawnmower worked properly. Richard, with his finely tailored suits and polished shoes, felt a little out of place in these humble surroundings, but he pushed through it, determined to make himself useful. There was a beauty in these small, unremarkable moments. No press releases, no cameras, just a man trying to do what was right. Eli wasn't easy to read. He had his guard up as expected, and the young man often seemed lost in his thoughts while they worked. But Richard could sense the faintest shift, a small change in the air. The silence was no longer as heavy. When Richard first arrived, Eli would barely acknowledge him, his eyes sharp, his tone clipped. But now, as they worked side by side, there was a slight loosening in the tension between them. Eli began to engage, if only in small ways. At first, it was a brief nod when Richard passed him a tool, then a word or two about the task at hand. Then one day, as they sat on the back porch after finishing a particularly grueling project, Eli spoke up. "Did you know I used to help my mom with cars?" Eli asked, his voice surprisingly soft, almost tentative, as though the words were heavy with meaning. Richard, taken aback, turned toward him. "No, I didn't know that. You work with cars?" Eli nodded, his gaze turning distant as if he were lost in the memory. "Yeah, she never had much, but she made sure I knew how to take care of things. Cars were the one thing she always said could make a difference. She'd tell me to fix them, to learn them inside and out. People would bring their cars to us all the time, and she'd teach me. I kind of liked it, working with my hands, you know?" Richard's heart swelled. There it was, the connection he had longed for. It wasn't about grand gestures or expensive gifts. It was about the small things that made Eli who he was. Richard had been searching for a way to relate, to truly understand his grandson, and here in this moment, Eli had offered him a window into his soul. "I think that's amazing, Eli," Richard said, his voice quieter now, more sincere. "You've got a real skill there. I can see how much it means to you." Eli's expression softened, though he was still cautious. "Yeah, it's just a dream. You know, I don't know if it'll ever be anything more than that. Not many people around here have the money to make something of it." Richard thought for a moment before responding. "You know, I've been around a lot of successful people in my life, Eli. And one thing I've learned is that money isn't always the key to success. It's about passion. If you want to make something of it, I'll help you in any way I can." Eli looked at him, surprise flickering in his eyes. Richard had never offered him anything like this before. Not this freely, not this honestly. It was a small step, but it was something. Richard wasn't offering to change his life with wealth or influence. He wasn't offering to buy Eli's dreams. He was simply saying, "I believe in you." Eli didn't say anything right away, but Richard could see the uncertainty in his eyes begin to fade. There was a quiet acceptance, like Eli was allowing himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, Richard wasn't the distant, cold figure he had once thought him to be. He wasn't some wealthy businessman trying to buy his way into Eli's life. He was simply someone trying to build a connection, one moment at a time. In the weeks that followed, Richard continued to show up. They worked on more projects together, sometimes fixing up things around Eli's house, other times just hanging out, talking about nothing in particular. The air between them began to clear, little by little. Eli started to open up more, about his past, his struggles, his hopes for the future. There was still a wariness in his tone, but it was less sharp than before. Richard knew that trust wasn't something Eli could just give him overnight, but it was a start. Each small step was a victory. One evening, as they were finishing up some work on the carport, Eli turned to Richard, his hands dirty and his face streaked with sweat. There was a flicker of something in his expression, a spark of gratitude, maybe, or something even deeper. "Thanks for sticking around, Richard," Eli said quietly, his voice almost unrecognizable from the angry young man who had first met him. "I didn't think you'd keep coming back." Richard nodded, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I'm not going anywhere, Eli. Not this time. It wasn't much, but it was enough." Richard didn't need grand declarations. He didn't need to hear Eli say he forgave him. Not yet. For the first time in a long time, Richard felt like he was on the right path. He was building something, not out of money or power, but out of shared moments, shared labor, and a growing understanding between them. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't be easy, but it was real. And that, Richard realized, was enough. As they finished up for the day, Eli wiped his hands on a rag, then held it out to Richard. There was no pretense in the gesture, no hesitation. It was a simple, human moment, one that carried more weight than anything Richard had done in the past. Richard shook his hand firmly, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't a clean slate yet, but it was a beginning. And for the first time in years, Richard had hope for himself, for Eli, and for the family he had lost and was now trying so hard to rebuild. The day Eli packed up his car to leave for college was one of the most emotional moments Richard had experienced in years. The car, packed to the brim with clothes, textbooks, and the tools that Eli had come to cherish over the years, was a symbol of everything Eli had worked for, everything Richard had never thought to give him. As Eli loaded the last of his things into the back of the old sedan, Richard stood by the front door of the modest house, watching with a mixture of pride and bittersweet sorrow. It was hard for him to believe how much had changed. Just months before, Eli had been a stranger, a young man full of anger and distrust, unwilling to let Richard into his life. But now, as he loaded his car and prepared to head off to the small local college where he would study automotive engineering, Richard knew that their bond was different. It was real. It wasn't perfect, but it was stronger than anything Richard had imagined when he first set out to make amends. Richard had always been the kind of man who could make things happen. His wealth, his connections, his influence, he had used all of it to build an empire. But none of it had prepared him for this. None of it had prepared him for the slow, steady work of earning back the love of a son who had died far too young, and the grandson he had never known. All the money in the world couldn't give him back the time he had lost, but it could help him create something new. It was the simple moments, the shared silences as they worked together on Eli's home, the late-night talks about dreams and fears that had brought them here. Eli had never asked for anything grand, never wanted Richard to buy his way into his life. Instead, Eli had wanted something much more meaningful, a genuine connection. Richard had learned to listen, to be patient, to let go of his need to control everything. With every small gesture of kindness, offering to help with a home repair, sitting side by side in the quiet of the evening, they had started to rebuild. The past wasn't something Richard could erase, nor did he want to. It had shaped both of them, and it would always be there in the background. But the future was something they could shape together. Eli came around to the front of the car, wiping his hands on his jeans, a nervous smile on his face. "I think that's everything," he said, though there was a slight catch in his voice. It was the kind of smile that spoke of both excitement and uncertainty. He was leaving behind the only life he had known, stepping into something new. And though he didn't say it out loud, Richard could sense the weight of the moment. Richard nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I'm proud of you, Eli. You've worked hard for this." His voice was thick with emotion, but he held it together, not wanting to overwhelm the moment. "Thanks, Richard," Eli said, shifting uncomfortably from one foot to the other. He reached out, offering a handshake, the same kind of gesture that had signaled the beginning of their fragile connection. But this time, it wasn't a handshake full of tension, full of doubt. It was different, more solid, more assured. Eli's hand gripped Richard's with strength, not because of power, but because of the trust they had begun to build. The trust Richard had worked so hard to earn. "Take care of yourself, Eli," Richard said, his voice quieter now. "And remember, I'm here if you need anything. Always." Eli nodded, his expression softer than Richard had ever seen it. "I will. I won't forget." He gave Richard one last look before sliding into the car and starting the engine. Richard stood there for a long moment as Eli drove away, the sound of the car's engine fading into the distance. He watched the taillights disappear around the corner, his chest tight. A part of him wanted to hold on to Eli, to keep him close, but Richard knew better now. Eli was his own person, with his own dreams and ambitions. The only thing Richard could do now was to continue supporting him, from afar if need be, but always ready to offer guidance when Eli was ready. Turning back toward the house, Richard felt a wave of emotion wash over him. The home felt quieter now, emptier in some ways, but there was peace in it. The journey they had started together was far from over. There would be challenges ahead, no doubt. Eli was still figuring out who he was, and Richard still had much to learn about being the kind of grandfather Eli needed. But for the first time, Richard felt confident in the future. It wouldn't be easy. It would take time and patience, and above all, trust. Richard walked back inside, the door closing softly behind him. As he sat down in his favorite chair, he thought about the long road he had traveled to get here. He thought about Lucas, the son he had failed, and the grandson he was just beginning to know. Richard had made many mistakes in his life, but he knew now that redemption wasn't about erasing those mistakes. It was about moving forward, about trying to make things right, one step at a time. He had done the best he could, and that was all he could ask for. The road to redemption was long, but it was one he was no longer walking alone. And in that, he found peace. There was still so much to look forward to, so much to build together with Eli. Richard closed his eyes, and for the first time in a long while, he felt hope. A hope that, with time, they would both find their way. A hope that their bond would continue to grow, nurtured by understanding, patience, and the promise of a new beginning. And so, with that hope in his heart, Richard took a deep breath, knowing that this was only the beginning of a much longer journey, one that he was ready to take side by side with his grandson. Years passed, and the quiet transformation of Richard and Eli's relationship continued. The distance between them, once defined by anger, neglect, and regret, was now bridged by shared moments, patience, and a quiet understanding that neither of them had expected. Eli graduated from college with honors in automotive engineering, his dreams now tangible, his future full of promise. Richard stood in the back of the crowded auditorium, watching his grandson walk across the stage, his chest swelling with pride. He had witnessed this moment from the sidelines, not as the father he had hoped to be, but as the grandfather he had learned to become. It was enough. That night, after the ceremony, Eli invited Richard to dinner at a small, unassuming restaurant, the kind of place they had once passed by without a second thought. As they sat across from each other, a simple meal in front of them, Eli spoke with the same quiet determination that had defined him throughout his journey. "I couldn't have done this without you," he said softly, his voice steady but full of emotion. "You gave me something no one else did. Not money, not power. You gave me your time. You gave me your trust. And that's all I ever needed." Richard looked at his grandson, his eyes wet with unshed tears. For the first time in his life, he truly understood what it meant to be part of someone's life, not by force, but by choice. His heart, once cold and hardened by years of regret, now swelled with love. The kind of love that wasn't transactional, but unconditional. The kind that could heal even the deepest wounds. "Thank you, Eli," Richard replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've taught me more than I could ever teach you." And as they sat there, in that simple restaurant, Richard realized that this was the legacy he would leave behind. Not the empire he had built, not the wealth or the power, but the chance to start again, the chance to make things right, the chance to love even when it seemed too late. As they left the restaurant together that evening, Richard felt lighter than he had in years. There was no more guilt, no more regret, only the quiet knowledge that they had both found their way together. It was a new beginning, a legacy of change. And Richard was at peace, knowing that the road he had traveled, however long, however painful, had led him exactly where he needed to be, with Eli by his side. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story and for watching the video until the very end. Your support means the world to me. If you enjoyed the journey of Richard and Eli, don't forget to give this video a like, and if you'd like to hear more stories like this, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Your feedback and engagement help me create even more content that I hope will inspire and resonate with you. Thanks again, and I look forward to sharing more with you soon. Thank you for watching. Please note, this video was generated using AI technology to read the story. While we strive for accuracy and clarity, there may be some occasional errors or mispronunciations. We kindly ask for your understanding and patience if any mistakes occur. If you notice any issues or areas for improvement, please feel free to leave a comment below. Your feedback is invaluable and will help us enhance the quality of our future videos. We appreciate your support and engagement. Thank you for being part of our community. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content, and we'll see you in the next video.